Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Back in February, when President Zelensky marked the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, he said that the Ukraine war had united the entire world. Well, President Zelensky is right about a lot of things, but on this point, I think he was wrong, because the Ukraine war has shown how deeply divided the world actually is. We've had all of those countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East sitting on the fence and abstaining in votes in the United Nations to condemn Russia. We've seen that many of the world's big democracies, like Brazil, Turkey, India, or Indonesia, or Serbia in Europe, have sat on the fence and refused to impose sanctions against Russia. We've learned from this debate that we're often very divided with what we call the global south on values and standards, on priorities, for example, debt, hunger, development, climate change, pandemic resilience, and on perceptions of who is right and who is wrong. Clearly, the Ukraine war has been bad news for many countries in the global south when it comes to inflation, food shortages, supply chain disruptions. They would like the war to be over as quickly as possible, regardless of who wins. And they think that if Russia is largely to blame, the West, NATO expansion, are also responsible. They also, of course, accuse the West of double standards in condemning Russia's actions, whereas for much of the last 20 years, it was the US or the Europeans intervening in places like Libya, Afghanistan, the Balkans, and Iraq. They also like to sit on the fence and hedge their bets, because this serves their interests. They remember that taking sides during the Cold War often put them in a meat grinder where they rarely emerged better off than they were before. This is about defending their interests rather than the interests of Russia and China or the interests of the United States. Now, over the last few weeks, we've seen a flurry of diplomatic activity by the US and Europeans, visits to Africa, visits to the Middle East, to Central Asia, to Latin America, to try to re-engage the global south and start winning its trust back. And last weekend, the G7 meeting in Hiroshima in Japan also made a big effort in this respect, inviting India, Brazil, Indonesia, the Comoros, currently chairing the African Union, and the Cook Islands, currently heading the Pacific Islands Forum. Not South Africa, interestingly, which has invited Putin, now an indicted war criminal, to attend a BRICS meeting in South Africa in the autumn. It was also useful that President Zelensky went to Saudi Arabia for the Arab League summit on his way to Hiroshima and spoke to many of the global south leaders in Japan as well, trying to point out that they should take sovereignty and non-interference as a principle of international relations as importantly as he does. Indeed, President Joe Biden was due to go to Papua New Guinea, the first ever US president to visit that country, but unfortunately had to postpone the trip because of the debt ceiling crisis back in Washington. Now, the G7 announced some initiatives, debt relief. It's already begun in the case of Zambia. Secondly, a new global infrastructure fund with $600 billion of capitalization to help develop projects dealing with food security, supply chains, green energy, telecoms, and so on. These investments, to quote the G7, will be fair and transparent, which is an obvious dig at China's One Belt, One Road program. Citigroup was also invited to go to the G7, along with other private sector companies, the idea being that the involvement of the private sector, to quote Ursula von der Leyen, will turn billions of investment into trillions of investment as we go forward. Now, it's easy for some critics to denounce these sort of big international meetings with their spectacular media announcements. For example, Max Lawson, the head of inequality policy at Oxfam, said that, why bother if you're a global south leader to go on a long flight to Japan just for a 2-hour meeting? But If we're going to win back the trust of the global south, I would argue that we have to start somewhere. As Joe Biden said, democracy can deliver, we have to deliver. So how can we get the attention of the global south and convince it that we don't just want to have it from time to time when we need it to support our objectives, but that we are sincerely concerned with its own interests and its own development ambitions? Well, number one, we've got to be realistic. We can't expect these countries to stop hedging and suddenly to tilt in our direction. For example, many were hoping that the election in Turkey would bring about the triumph of the opposition that would immediately re-engage with the West and NATO, but President Erdogan, at least at the moment, looks fairly confident of being re-elected, so don't expect any major tilts. They are going to stay on the fence. But secondly, we need to tone down the rhetoric, not present this as you have to be in the camp of the authoritarians or the camp of the democracies. The global south doesn't really associate itself or identify with these concepts. Much better to talk about obeying the rule of law versus anarchy and versus impunity. That's much more in their interest and likely to resonate with them. Third, we need to stress that the glass is half full and not always half empty. We tend always to criticize the global south for buying arms from Russia or accepting investments from China, neglecting the fact that we are also doing a lot of business with these countries as well. For example, the United States this year has signed 2 major agreements with India, one on technology sharing, quantum computing, semiconductors, commercial space opportunities, also high-performance computing, and one on defense cooperation, building jet engines together, munitions, surveillance and reconnaissance systems, maritime security, and so on. These countries also want to do business with us. That is also part of hedging, and we need, therefore, to build on that. The next thing is we need to improve our offer. For example, some years ago, back in 2003, the West, at a COP meeting, agreed to devote $100 billion a year to the global south for climate change adaptation. We have never got anywhere near that figure, even 20 years later. So promises like the EU's Global Gateway or the US Congressional Fund for Infrastructure or the G7 Global Investment Initiative have to be backed up by true action to show the global south that we are really serious and that we have something concrete, apart from rhetoric, to put on the table. It's quite interesting for the global south that whereas 90% of international humanitarian aid for Ukraine has been funded, when it comes to Yemen or when it comes to Ethiopia or Syria, the figure is less than 40%. So double standards are something that resonate. We have to avoid them. In Munich last February, President Macron said that I am struck at how much we have lost the trust of the global south. True, but trust can be regained. We have to convince the global south that indeed it's the West and the democracies that represent the long-term future in terms of innovation, in terms of development, in terms of tackling climate change, in terms of open fair trade and all the rest, not China and Russia. The time to start that effort is now. Thank you for watching this week. As always, I enjoyed your company and I look forward to engaging with you next week.